I'm going to talk to you about today is about ethics in cannabis, and how we see ethics, and how we see the ethics of the business going on out here, the expo, how we can see the ethics of the law, the markets, and a whole range of things. But to do that, we've got to understand what ethics are. And ethics really are a reflection of ourselves in a very relational world, how we connect to various aspects of our worlds. And I'll be using this expo as a frame to do that, so that when you leave, you can walk around and maybe look at it in different terms. And what I'm particularly interested in is what's on the slide up there, which is these relationships between humans and plants. How do humans relate to plants? And how do plants, moreover, relate to humans? We live in a world which is very much about discussing human stories. But these are not the only stories. We can look at things from a plant point of view too. And we live in a very ethical time. We live in a time where people are telling stories of ethics. We have the Me Too movement, and we have the Trump movement, and we have ideas of moral economy, the ideas of fair trade, and the idea that somehow when we produce goods and we sell goods and we trade goods, that these need to be done in some way to reflect a better sense of who we are and a better sense of what we're doing. So I want to look at that. And that idea of ethics in business has been going on for some time. The fair trade is just the tip of where we are today. And this idea of producing things with less chemicals and producing things organically and with less packaging and environmental concerns, that's what's going on where we are now. So if we look at that, if we look at where cannabis is now, we'll see a number of different movements going on here. We have a market going on, a whole way the market's going on, people selling different things, people trying to make their way, a lot of petty, small entrepreneurs making things, and the cannabis market changing, becoming bigger, with the bigger corporations coming in and bigger investments coming in. And we've got technological changes. Everything we see around us, the technology around us, those are changing. And we've got ideas of medicine, many different ideas of medicine going on in cannabis. And we have what science is producing and how science produces knowledge about cannabis also goes on. And of course, the big one that has been going on for many years is the way the law affects how we see cannabis, how we use cannabis, how we sell cannabis. And then we have the relationship of cannabis with the soil itself, this idea of horticulture, how it grows. And we've got our cultural uses. How do we use cannabis? Whilst right now everyone keeps talking about medicine, actually it's used in a variety of ways in a lot of different places around the world. It has many different uses. But I want to do this from the point of view of a plant. I want to look at that plant-human relationship more. Because although we often think of plants as just objects out there that we do what we want with, it doesn't really work like that. And that's one of the reasons you eat, is because you actually need the plant far more than what you do to the plant. And cannabis itself is quite an interesting plant because it's quite animate. It changes the way we think in many ways. And although humans are powerful rearrangers of the world, they're not the only ones. The very chair you're sitting on right now is rearranging you. It's making you sit in a particular way. The shoes on your feet and these flat surfaces change the way you think throughout the day because you're not crawling over other plants or stones. You can divert your attention. The way these foods come to us, the way this building protects us from the outside is affecting us. And these plants in the building and outside, there's a very nice tree in the square, they're starting to affect us. We're not the only ones arranging the world. And for me, the ethics of cannabis lie in that relationship as things come together. And it's how we reflect on those relations. And I'm less interested in understanding drugs in society, and I'm more interested in what the plants or plant-like drugs or other drugs actually say about society. I'm interested in the mirror. If I start to look at it in a plant mirror, if I start to try and understand that plant perspective, what do I start to understand about the human being and those human worlds? How do they come to life? Now, you might say, hang on, that's anthropomorphizing. That's taking human ideas and it's putting them into plants. Really, scientifically, that doesn't really happen. This is not possible. The world of science really explains our world. Science is the new God we have, which gives us understandings. And there's truth in it, but it's not as true as we think. I mean, take the plane that took me here. There it is. And that's how it takes off. There's a little bit of the science in how it takes off. That's what the science of the plane journey is. But my life experience on that plane is very different. My experience is I'm sort of sat rather cramped up. I'm having a conversation with the person next to me, avoiding the other person next to me, getting worried in turbulence, and all of these sort of things are happening. My experience isn't that scientific. You have a whole load of cellular activity going on in your body, a whole set of atomic and subatomic realities going on here. We're spinning around in this universe. But that's not your day-to-day experience. You don't experience the science. And what we see with the markets here, especially with this tale of CBD and THC and benefits to the body, we start to see that our lives are being explained in scientific ways in order to explain things. But I'm saying, what happens if we come back and we start to understand the human from other perspectives, not just science? I'm not dismissing it, but I'm saying there's other ways of seeing the world. And I'll try and tell you what I mean. So here's a picture. What is the coming together in this picture? We have a person, and like you, they're sitting on the chair, which is causing them to sit in a particular way with their human-type body, and they have a dog. But they have a relationship with the dog. The dog is possibly why they're there. The dog is bringing them together, and they connect with the dog. But they're also connecting with the other chairs, and they're connecting with the grass on the ground, and there in the background is that forest, there's the wood, and it's causing them to feel certain things. In fact, that's why they're there. That's one of the reasons they've gone to sit there, is to experience these plants and the open air and their dog. They're wanting these things to change them. They're wanting to take them out of their world they were in and put them into another world. And right here, where we are, we have a coming together. Everything's coming together. And what it's coming together around, ironically, is a plant. The reason we're all here today is not because we are some sort of rational brain walking around on a stick. That's part of it. But it's actually to do with our relationships with plants. This is all an expo about human-plant relations. So maybe we need to start seeing it from a plant point of view. I'll give you an example. How does the dog see the world? Does it see it the same as the person in the chair? Probably not. But it's a valid point of view. The dog sees the world as it is for a dog. Now we know in the world of trees, we know now that the communication between trees is subterranean. It's underground. There's a lot of research gone into that. We know that plants are themselves communicative. And we also know that their cellular communication is the same cellular communication at a very, very minute molecular level, is the same one that's in animals. There is some sort of communication going on, and this person in the chair is in some way communicating with plants. So plants really are companions. And then what happens? What happens as we start to consume plants? What happens as we start to integrate plants into our lives? I think one of the difference, if we were at a carrot festival or a potato festival, I think it'd be a different crowd. I think it'd be people experiencing the world differently. Because one of the things going on with cannabis, which is less talked about amongst ideas of it giving a euphoria, or it's giving anti-anxiety, or it giving anxiety, or whatever all these medical terms we try to put on it, it is causing other things. And one of the things cannabis does very well is it causes ideas of connectivity, and it causes amplifications in meaning. Things become more meaningful, and we can connect very well when cannabis is affecting us. And that creates a certain degree of creativity, which we see through cultural forms. And when we see patients taking it, and we talk to those patients, we discover that unlike some medicines, and more like herbal medicines, they see themselves on healing journeys. And even when they're not healing, even when they're in the dying process and they're taking cannabis medicines, they see themselves on a journey with the plant medicine. They start to integrate with it. But it's a confusing plant. We like to think, and this gives the impression, that we are in command of it. We like to think that we can reduce it down to CBD and THC and some other cannabinoids, and we like to think that we can standardize it and do things with it, and we can control the experience. But it is an unruly plant. It has its own agency. It doesn't easily conform. It is rather hard to standardize it. It is rather hard to standardize the genetics and the growing medium. It won't quite conform to it. It is very hard to standardize the effect it has on people's perceptions of the world. We can't seem to do that. It has its own effects. So, what is the relationship we have with this plant? And I've chosen this picture specifically. What is the value of cannabis? What is it worth to us? Because in any societal setting, we start to understand the world by looking at that. If I look at this computer, what is it worth to me? And you might go, how much is it worth? Well, that's because we live in a very monetary world, and that's the first question that comes to us. But that's not the only question. What is it worth to me in my life values? What is it worth to me in my relationships with others? What is it worth to me in my ability to communicate? What is worth to me in the health of my body? What is worth to me politically? What is the value of cannabis? What is it worth? And what does it make you desire? Because if we look at this here, we'll see that those desires can be social. We can see they can be monetary. They can be medicinal. We'll see lots of desires going on through cannabis. So let's reassess those categories. And let's look at those markets. Because what's happening in the marketplace is there's a projection of stories. People are telling stories, and they're telling stories off the stories, trying to generate value, monetary value, from creating stories around objects in order for people to connect to those objects and consume them in particular ways. And they're doing so in a particular legal framework. But as I said before, that's not the only story going on. The plant is actually bringing the market together. The plant is creating the cannabis sector as much as the people in the cannabis sector are creating it and creating the plant. It is a two-way relationship. And the qualities of the plant bring in certain people, and it's the way we can work with it, and the way we can monetize it, and the way we can grow it, and the way we can give it legality, which are particular to that plant, also bring people together in particular ways. And if we look at medicine, and there's a variety of diseases, we also have different models of medicine coming together with cannabis. We have pharmaceutical medicine at one end of the spectrum, and we have this folk medicine at the other end of the spectrum. And we have differences of opinion and different ways of marketing to those things. And yet, in those medicines, we have different journeys. So someone taking a very pure synthesized form of cannabis may have a different medical journey to those who are taking a herbal route. They'll have a different view of the world. They'll see the world differently. They'll see their body differently. They might have very different politics as well. And this idea of cannabis healing us, well, that is also interpreted differently by different people. And part of that is the idea of science. So what the market does with science is it really uses it. And it's not just cannabis, it's any sort of field. The market uses science and science uses the market, because any research that comes out on cannabis which is favorable is picked up by the market. And the market then funds more scientific research. And as we're getting the bigger corporations coming in, we're getting a lot more scientific and medical research on cannabis than ever before. And all those early research findings are put out into public as to this is what it does, even if scientifically we're not sure if it does do that yet. And some diseases in that funding get more money than other funding. So cancer research, getting a lot of cannabis funding, multiple sclerosis, lots of cannabis funding, but other diseases, less cannabis funding. And we see the science of it turning it into cloths, turning it into chairs, turning it into concrete. We see science trying to standardize the plant and fragment the plant. But we never talk about the scientists working with it, consuming the plant. We say, well, that's separate from the science. But of course, for scientific researchers working with cannabis, there's going to be a percentage of them consuming cannabis. Will that change the science? Will that change their scientific thinking? We know it's changed music. We know it's changed art. These have been openly discussed portals of cannabis use. But as cannabis becomes more legitimate, we're going to see scientists working with cannabis, using cannabis, and coming up with other ways of seeing things. And we've got to be careful with science, because it is a very strong ideology. We kind of hold it as a truth and as a holder of knowledge. But in many cultures around the world, plants themselves contain knowledge. If we look at people in South America and in Africa and in Asia, there's a very long tradition, going back thousands of years, of gardening and gardening knowledge through plants, and seeing the plants as part of the human. And as soon as we scientize the discussion, as soon as it becomes scientific, we move away from that. But that is still going on. It's only because we live in Europe that we think, no, it's all CBD and THC. Are we listening to the knowledge of the plants? And then we have the whole sort of technology, everything you can see, for everything that's been made by people here, from these speakers to this carpet to this hall, everything coming together to bring that little bit of cannabis through, these relationships happening. And those designers of the world will now be more using cannabis and other drugs as part of their lifestyle. And then we have horticulture. Not only how it's grown, and the talk is how we standardize it and how we can grow it in controlled environments and how we can grow medical grade standards. But a plant has its own needs. The plant is not a potato. It needs different things. The plant has its own needs. And we don't really talk about those stories so much. And then we have the law. And the law is really a very moralistic storytelling about the world that is violent, ultimately violent in order to get its means. And the law protects a lot of the companies here because it says you have a right to private property, you have a right to sell. But it also regulates them and says you can only have CBD, you can only have this amount of THC. It starts putting in some crazy laws. I was talking to a Dutch company. One company has to sell the electricity or the lights, another company can sell the seeds, another company can sell pots and containers. The law sort of trying to deal with plant life and becoming quite absurd in the process. But the plant is unruly. And so as long as we have this idea of medicine and a healing plant that creates healing people, there will always be, with cannabis, this unruly part of the plant, for unruly people, these more sort of people who don't quite fit in, who aren't quite medical. And they become still stigmatized. They still become unruly people. And the people in the history of cannabis have been killed, they've been incarcerated, they've had children taken from them, they've lost property, they've lost jobs. And really, they did that all for the plant. The plant has a relationship with them that led them to take certain risks. And a major strand with the legitimacy of their relationship with the plant got them to see the power of the state. And they said, this is not legitimate. As it becomes more legitimate, how are people going to see things? And we also see in culture, arts, socializing, food, eating, sex, manual labor, and monotonous tasks, we constantly see the use of cannabis. So where does that leave us? And if you look at this picture, somewhere in the background, you will start to see the money hiding through. Because the cannabis we have is produced in the world we have. It's not separate from it. And what do we live in? We live in a very monetary world. We have excelled in producing a sort of marketplace world which has produced the environmental crisis we live in today. We produce huge amounts of commodities. We live in a world which is increasingly starting to say one group is different from another group, and that the two can't combine. We're starting to create as many others as we can. But I think as we start to do that, we ignore the money going on in the background of this. We ignore the generation of money as a focus. Because there is a myth about cannabis that somehow it's the peace drug. It makes everyone feel happy and peaceful. But actually it's an amplifier. If that's who you are, that'll take you. If you want to make money, it'll make you think of different ways to make money. If you want to make war, it'll find different ways for you to make war. And the economy has a very gravitational pull. It pulls you in, and it pulls you into certain ways of doing things. And I look at this market, and there are some people here who are really fighting that. I heard a story today, a very successful company, and yet someone spends their time giving away oils. They don't sell them, they give them to patients to try and heal them. Other companies trying to get every penny out of it they can. Cannabis is produced in the world. It is not some sort of medicine in itself. It doesn't cure us of it. So if we start to look at the cannabis, if we start to look into what's going on, if we start to look at all those aspects to it, and we use our ethical reflections on who we want to be and what we want the world to be, and we start untangling the stories people are telling, and we step back from that noise of instant karma, flashing dollars, and endless life, and we see that we too are life forms. We too are integrated in that life form that a plant is. It's not that different. We like to think it is, but it really isn't. And what our relationship with that becomes, whether we want to be in charge, whether we want to colonize the plant worlds, or whether we want to live in a closer relationship with our environment. Because there are two markets going on here. One market is very much the market that creates a lot of waste, the market that is causing environmental crisis, and the other market is trying to deal with it. And they're both happening here. What are we going to invest in? And that's really is what I'm here to say. We've got to start talking about the ethics of the cannabis business. Because just because it's cannabis doesn't make it ethical. Just because it used to be illegal and now is more legal doesn't make it ethical. Everyone's saying the cannabis world is changing, but I don't think it is. I think it's becoming more normal. I think it's now starting to adhere to pharmaceutical models, and it's starting to adhere to financial capital. In other words, cannabis is conforming. It's not changing, it's just conforming. And the only people who can change that, if that's not the world you want, is you. So that's the end of my talk, and thank you very much, and thank you very much for the festival for inviting me to talk. Thank you.